greatest driver of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, such CH4, which is methane, came primarily from the agricultural activities. Nitrous oxide came primarily from the fertilizer. Deforestation and land use change is an important driver because forests are cleared for the agriculture, for the human development, but also for the livestock farming, and the carbon that was stored.
So thank you so much, Saba Bakini, joining us. RESO platform from Italy. It's again a possibility and opportunity for platform to have people like you with different disciplines and streams. And hopefully, it's going to be a wonderful discussion and record sociology for our audience. So RESO is a platform like I've already briefed you. In a world inundated with information, large body of quantitative and qualitative data around, RESO strives to step through the noise to cause you most reliable and relevant sociological explanations on various societal topics which matter today. Thanks a lot once again joining, ma'am. And I would like to start with my first question, very important question as your student also. It says like, please give us a description of your thesis, including your title, methodology, objectives, your findings, and conclusion.
Thank you very much for your questions. So, the title of my thesis was Combined Effects of Heatwave and Microplastics on the Scleractinian Coral Astroides calicularis. Marine heat waves and microplastics, as we know, are pressing problems, especially for the Mediterranean Sea, but also for the oceans and seas all over the world. So, marine heat waves causes a lot of mass mortality events in the Mediterranean Sea. And microplastics create problems for some species because of the entanglement, but also the ingestions of plastics. So the main purpose of my thesis was to investigate the effects of these multiple stressors on this biological model. This is the first study of its kind because there are no data available on these biological species, and also it is the first study of its kind on an zooxanthellate coral, because usually the studies are done on zooxanthellate corals. Also, my study is there was a previous study that was done with the same colonies as my study, and in this study it was studied the excretion and also the respiration rate, and it was measured an alteration in these rates. So they decided that it was important to understand if it was present any kind of oxidative damage or stress. So these corals were frozen and taken to my university in Milan to assess if there was any kind of stress. So, speaking about the experimental design, these colonies were exposed in vivo into 4 different experimental conditions. In the first condition, the colonies were exposed at a temperature of 26 degrees with the presence of microplastics, but also in the absence of microplastics. And the same thing was done at 29 degrees. So 29 degrees is the temperature of the heat wave. In fact, the experiment lasted 4 weeks. Each week, the temperature was raised by 1 degree. So this is the simulation of the heat wave, and the temperature of 29 degrees was reached and kept for 2 weeks. And also the microplastics that were present have a size of 2 millimeters, and they were made of polyethylene. And the concentration was the environmental concentration present in the Mediterranean Sea. Speaking about materials and method that I used, I created an homogenate with the tissue of the coral, and I've done a series of biomarkers to understand if there was any kind of oxidative stress or damage. In conclusion, I can briefly summarize that there was no effect generated by the presence of microplastics, because the retention time of plastics inside the coral was not long enough to create some kind of damage, but also the concentration that we used is an environmental concentration. In other study, we can see some kind of effects because they used an higher concentration. And also it could be interesting to analyze these corals for a longer period to understand if there was any kind of damage for a longer period. On the contrary, there was some kind of cellular stress that was done by the heat wave. So, in conclusion, we can say that there are no combined effects of the two stressors, but the presence of the heat wave have had a little bit of oxidative stress. But maybe if we can take intermediate sample during these 4 weeks, we can see some kind of alteration that we didn't see at the end of the 4 week, because maybe there was some kind of homeostatic compensation. So, in conclusion, these are the results of my thesis.
So thank you so much once again. It is important for us to sort of see people's perceptions, especially academicians and researchers, though it's very much technical terminology you've used, like coral tissue samples and uh, other materials that you've talked about, but such an important possibility for our audience also, because we do have a variety of audience who can understand better applied science and pure science, and how research is done in marine ecosystem and how it impacts the global climate change. So that's what we figure out. So thank you so much sharing with us your objectives, your methodology, your conclusion, and your findings. It's important. Thank you so much. A good brief up. So
You're welcome.
would like to move on to my second question. One question says, like, in your opinion, what are the main drivers of climate change?
In my opinion, one of the greatest drivers of climate change is, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions, such the emission of CO2, methane, but also nitrous oxide. As we all know, greenhouse gas trap the heat inside the atmosphere, and this tends to rise the global temperature. For example, CO2 comes primarily from the burning of fossil fuels that we use for the energy, the transportation, but also for the industry. CH4, which is methane, came primarily from the agricultural activities and from the livestock farming. And of course, nitrous oxide came primarily from the fertilizer. This is one of the greatest drivers, in my opinion, but also deforestation and land use change is an important driver, because forests are cleared for the agriculture, for the human development, but also for the livestock farming, and the carbon that was stored is released as CO2. Also, there is a reduction in the Earth absorption of carbon, and this increases the global warming. Also, there is the conversion of natural landscape to farmland and urban areas, and this tends to disrupt the ecosystem and also the biodiversity. Another important driver is represented also by the industrial processes. So the greenhouse gas emission and other pollutants are produced. And of course, for example, the cement production releases a lot of CO2, but also the chemical industry releases a lot of pollutants in our seas, but also on land. Speaking about agriculture, also the livestock farming represent an important driver, because a lot of methane is released, but also the overuse of water and soil degradation is an important problem. Another important driver is also the transportation. As we all know, we are using the burning of fossil fuels to move, and this releases a lot of CO2. Also, the energy production is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emission. In fact, the burning of coal, oil, and natural gases is important to generate heat and electricity, and this releases a significant amount of CO2. Also, the waste management is an important driver because by incinerating the waste, a lot of CO2 is released. Of course, nowadays, overpopulation is an important problem, and the population is rising really quickly. So, also, another important driver is represented by buildings and urbanization. There is a high energy consumption that is coming from the heating, the cooling, and the lighting, and many fossil fuels are used for these purposes. And the urbanization also increased the demand for energy, transportation, and infrastructure. So, in my opinion, these are the main drivers that are present nowadays.
So thank you so much briefing us up on this important area, the main drivers of climate change. You've used like CO2, CH4, greenhouse gases, and the carbon store. Very important concepts. We get to hear them in media, mainstream channels, newspapers, research papers, and articles. But hardly we understand the very impact of it in our society and how they become and sort of turn the main drivers of climate change. A good brief up for our audience. Thanks a lot for that. Would like to move on to my third question. Says, what are the primary issues according to you associated with global climate change?
Oh, in my opinion, one of the main issues associated with the climate change is, of course, the presence of extreme weather events. For example, the events that took place not long time ago in Valencia is an important example of these extreme weather events. So the temperature is rising pretty quickly, and also the frequency and the intensity of these events is rising. For example, hurricanes, heat waves, floods, and also drought tend to disrupt the ecosystem and the biodiversity and threaten the human health. These also have an important economic cost for the significant property damage. Another important issue is, of course, the rising of sea levels because of the melting of the glaciers and the ice cap. This problem threatens, of course, the coastal communities, the infrastructure, and the ecosystems, and there is an increased risk of flooding, storm surges, and erosions. And in particular, island and coastal cities are at risk of displacement. Another important problem is represented by the ocean warming and the acidification, and these problems are deeply linked. So they threaten both the marine ecosystem. I can briefly explain these problems. So the temperature is rising. So also the CO2 absorption by the water is rising, and the water is becoming more warm and acid. And this tends to disrupt marine lives, especially coral reefs. Coral reefs are bleaching, and the biodiversity is there is an important reduction in biodiversity, and this increase in CO2 absorption tend to decrease the pH of the water. So the organism with calcium carbonate cells and skeletons, like shellfish and also coral, are in danger, and this tend to disrupt also the marine food chains. Another important issue is represented, of course, by the threats to biodiversity and ecosystems all around the world. So there is an important loss of habitats such as forests, wetlands, and also coral reef, like I said before. And for the species is very hard to survive and to reproduce. Also, the migration pattern and the breeding cycles are disrupted, and there is a reduced availability of food and water. So there is an important loss of biodiversity, and this tends to weaken the resilience of the ecosystems, and this tends to reduce the providing of essential servicing. Also, the water scarcity is an important issue. It's a growing global issue, exacerbated obviously by the climate change. The temperature is rising, and there is a changing of the precipitation. There is an increase in drought and reduced water availability. Another important issue, of course, is the human health risks. For example, heat strokes and respiratory diseases, because of the air pollution, of course. There are more vector-borne diseases because the habitat of the species is increasing because the temperature is rising, and also extreme weather events are more present. So as a consequence, there are injury and also mental health issues problems due to the trauma and the stress. And also, of course, another important issue is represented by the economic impacts. So the damage of the infrastructure and the crop failures, but also the health issues.
Thank you so much for letting us know on this important question. And as you mentioned, words like raising of glaciers and global climate change and coral reefs and shellfish. There's so many technical words have been used, but kind of narration that you've provided to our audience in this record sociological event is a wonderful piece of information, both quantitative and qualitative body of data being shared by you. So thanks a lot for that. And would like to move on now simultaneously to my fourth question. It says like the rise of ocean temperatures poses a threat to biodiversity. Explain in the context of marine ecosystem.
Course. Like I said before, an important problem for marine biodiversity is represented by the coral bleaching. So these coral reefs are important habitats. They are critical habitats for many marine species that are now in danger. There is also the problem of the disruption of species pattern. So the temperature is rising, and this tend to alter the migration, the breeding, and the feeding patterns for many marine species. And this affect, of course, the entire food chain and the ecosystem stability. There is also an important reduction in oxygen levels because warmer water tend to have less oxygen, and of course there is a creation of dead zones, and of course the biodiversity is in danger. And another important problem is represented by the marine pollution. Of course, this has an important impact on the ecosystem. Plastic pollution, like I've talked before, harms many marine mammals because of the entanglement and the ingestion of the plastics, and also the presence of chemical pollutants such as pesticides, heavy metals, oil spillings, and they contaminate the water and create serious problems to a lot of species. Another important issue for the marine species is represented by the nutrient runoff from the agriculture. This creates algal blooms, and as a consequence, there is a depletion of oxygen levels in the water. So also in this case, this creates a lot of dead zones. So an important loss of biodiversity. Another important issue is also represented by invasive species. They compete with the endemic species, and this disrupt the marine ecosystems.
Wise body of data you've shared with us, like using reduction of oxygen level in the marine ecosystem, then pollution, then plastic pollution you've talked about, which is certainly a major threat. We hear about those happenings in our news channels and videos and different things we come across, that how plastic pollution impacts marine ecosystem, and also like chemical pollution is also causing impacts on marine ecosystem as a threat it plays. So a wise body of data you've shared with us, relevant scientific things, a lot for that. It's really an eye-opening information for us. So would like to move on to my fifth question, again a wrap-up question, just a final one. It's but an important question. Says we as global society, that's we are looking your opinion, we as global society work to improve the deteriorating climate conditions.
To do something to change this situation. And in my opinion, the first thing to do is, of course, to reduce the emissions, to limit the global warming, and to mitigate the impacts. It's also important to restore the forest and to protect them, to mitigate the pollution, but also to reduce the presence of CO2 into the atmosphere. It's important to transition also to sustainable agricultural practices and to reduce the chemical use, to reduce the impacts, but also for our health. It's important to shift to electric vehicles and to invest in sustainable transport infrastructure to reduce our emissions. It's also important to transition to renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, or hydropower. And it's important to improve the energy efficiency and to support nuclear energy and clean technologies. We have to improve also the waste segregation and to improve the recycling rates and to reduce the overall waste generation. It's also important to promote energy efficient building and green spaces because, as I said before, the population is rising pretty quickly. So it is important to do it also in a short time because it's a problem and it would become an important problem in next years. So we have to reduce the carbon footprint of cities and we have to mitigate the climate change. We need also to enhance the climate resilience and improve the disaster preparedness. And it is also important to improve the coastal protection because we need to protect coral reef. They have a lot of ecosystem services that are really important for our health. And we need to restore also natural buffers such as mangroves and also wetlands. To solve the problem of ocean warming and acidification is really important to reduce the CO2 emissions, and we need to protect marine ecosystems to preserve the ocean health, but also our health. So we need also to better the water management and we need to improve the desalination technologies. And in conclusion, I can say that we need to take climate action right now and we need to also strengthen the healthcare system.
Thanks a lot for briefing us up on this. It's not just a brief up, but it's a great detail of narration that you've shared with us. You've talked about like pollution and then reduction of oxygen, plastic pollution. You've talked about and then chemical and CO2, greenhouse gases, and different varieties you've shared with us. A great in-depth detail, which like I'm very much surprised and it's fascinating for me. And you've talked about your thesis, including your methodology, your objectives, your conclusion, and your findings. And you've talked about the main drivers of climate change, primary issues associated with global climate change. You've shared with our audience and temperature rising threat on marine ecosystem and how we as society can improve, stand against climate change. Thanks a lot for sharing such a mighty and massive piece of detail with us, quantitative and qualitative, though tremendous technical perceptions and parts, dimensions you've shared with us. And I'm sure that's going to be a wonderful piece of information for our audience. It's certainly a big event for us, like having people like you've given a good presentation with tremendous scientific data and narration. Thanks a lot for that. So just want to brief you up once again on RESO platform. RESO is a platform where we just do a record sociology. Our main thematic narration and kind of orientation is a sociological approach, whether we cover marine systems or climate change, we talk about human rights, we talk about human trafficking, we talk about, or some other dimensions and domains we cover, but we actually look that particular issue or that particular thematic event from a sociological perspective. So this also is a cover which is going to be, we sort of look at this phenomena from a sociological perspective. So thanks a lot once again joining us from Italy. Thank you so much, ma'am.